Hey everybody, it's Max Blumenthal. Welcome to the Grayzone. We're here today with my partner in crime, Aaron Mate, and we've got our favorite military expert, former UN weapons inspector and former Marine intelligence officer, and author of the new book, Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika, Scott Ritter. Welcome, Scott.
Well, thanks for having me.
Great to have you back here at a really momentous time. Let me just get your book on screen for your new book on screen for everyone to see and buy. If you don't buy Scott's book, then you won't understand how far we've drifted from having leaders who don't want us to all die. That's my initial take on your book. But Scott, kind of give us the elevator pitch for your new book.
The elevator pitch. Look, this is a unique, never before told story of the creation and implementation of the foundational arms control treaty that set the stage for everything that came after that, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed by Gorbachev and Reagan in December of 1987. It was the first time that on-site inspection was incorporated in a meaningful fashion in treaty compliance verification. It's the story of, a group of inspectors overcoming every obstacle imaginable, including political opposition here in the United States by people like Senator Jesse Helms, who didn't want this treaty to work. Everybody conspired to make this treaty fail. And yet the inspectors, working with their Soviet counterparts, made it a success story. And that's the other aspect of it is this is a history of the Soviet Union during a time of critical change, perestroika, and the role that perestroika played not only in furthering the goals of disarmament, but eventually sowing the seeds that led to the dismantling, dismemberment, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And arms control played a critical part. I don't want to give away too much of the book, but let's just say that ballistic missile production that we were monitoring played an integral role in creating the conditions that led to the coup against Gorbachev in August of 1991 and the eventual collapse. So everything's linked together. But the last thing I'll say about this is it's not just a unique history of a very critically important time, told in a compelling fashion by the author, but it's also a template because when we look at the situation that exists today between the United States and Russia, a question that's very rarely asked, but should be asked by everybody is, where's the diplomatic off-ramp? I mean, one day this war in Ukraine will end. And how does the United States and Russia get back on the track of peaceful coexistence, of working in a manner that doesn't lead to nuclear conflict? And a lot of people think it's hopeless. The INF Treaty was the diplomatic off-ramp of the 1980s. In 1985, we were facing off against the Russia. We called them the evil empire. We were enemy number one. An American major was shot to death in East Germany as part of the post-Cold War monitoring regime that was there. We almost went to nuclear war twice in the 1980s. We had hundreds of thousands of troops faced off on hair-trigger alert to go to war. The INF Treaty created the conditions that allowed all of that to come to an end. So this book is a template of hope. When people say, how could we possibly do this? I say, read the book. History sometimes has lessons. There was George Santayana, a philosopher, said the people who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. But the implication there is that history is full of mistakes. Sometimes history provides a success story. And people who fail to learn the lesson of history will be unable to rely upon past models of success. The INF Treaty is a past model of success that could serve as a template for this diplomatic off-ramp from the situation the United States and Russia finds in today. So it's relevant on so many different levels, and I would encourage people to read it.
So that's Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika by Scott Ritter. Pick it up. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble and all the other sites. But this was published by Clarity Press, right?
Yes.
And Clarity Press is pumping out some great titles. So I really recommend buying directly from the publisher. But it's available everywhere, and it's a personal journal. So you're inside the room with Scott. But we're inside the virtual room with Scott now, and we're actually at a moment where diplomacy seems completely off the table, at least for the U.S. State Department, especially after the Kharkiv counteroffensive. And that's what I really wanted to dig into today, is the implications of this counteroffensive, where it appears that the Ukrainian army has scored a success, captured something like 4,000 square kilometers in an area where it appears the Russian Defense Ministry wasn't expecting an attack. It was lightly defended. They were defending around Kherson and repelling the Ukrainian attacks. But this this apparent victory, or moral victory, or I don't know what you want to call it, comes at an important time ahead of the winter, ahead of an important arms convention that Zelensky's appearing at in Texas. And it seems to have extended the war and enabled or justified further escalation, more military aid. That's kind of my general read. But Scott, you know more about this than I do. So what just happened around Kharkiv, and what are the repercussions going to be diplomatically and on the ground militarily?
Well, first of all, let me just preface any comments I'm about to make is that I'm sitting thousands of miles removed from the battlefield, and I don't have a hotline that gets me to either NATO headquarters, the Russian Ministry of Defense, or the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. So I'm dealing with the same information set, the data set that everybody else is dealing with. I don't have insider information. So I need to caveat that, because, this is informed speculation. But I'm somebody who is well-versed in war and things dealing with the military and military history. Back in May, I gave an interview with a gentleman named Garland Nixon. You might be familiar with him. He's
yeah.
Okay. And it was an interview I did with Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst. And at that time, we were talking about phase 2 of the Russian operation. Phase 1 being the initial phase, the drive on Kiev, et cetera. Phase 2 focusing on the Donbass. And the prevailing wisdom, which I concurred with, was that Russia was winning, hands down. The casualty ratios were 10, 15 to 1. There was no way the Ukrainian military would be able to sustain this. Even Zelensky was just like, we're losing too many people. But I also said at that time, the infusion of $53 billion worth of American military and financial assistance, together with the rest of Europe, it created a new reality. It was game-changing, and that this would be transformative in a manner which would make the Russian force structure currently allocated to the special military operation, hovering around 200,000 men, plus or minus a couple, 10,000, unsustainable. I mean, Russia could not win the conflict. And victory for Russia is defined by 3 principal things. 1, the liberation of the Donbass. 2, demilitarization. 3, denazification. Liberation of the Donbass is going to happen regardless. I don't think Russia is going to be unable to do this. Demilitarization. Russia defined demilitarization as the elimination of all NATO infrastructure in Ukraine. Well, the NATO army is now the Ukrainian army is now a de facto NATO army. So to achieve demilitarization, you're going to have to basically nullify the totality of the Ukrainian military, and 200,000 men wasn't going to be sufficient. Denazification is talking about radical political transformation in Ukraine, independent of government of Zelensky, outlawing these right-wing, right sector, Sloboda, and other ultra-nationalist, neo-Nazi affiliated parties, the eradication of Stepan Bandera and the ideology of ultranationalism from Ukraine. That's denazification. That's not going to happen by just sitting on your butt in the Donbass. It's going to require regime change in Kiev, and the Russia being able to impose its will on Western Ukraine, Lvov, etc. Not going to happen with 200,000 troops. And I said this back in May. I got attacked, raked over the coals. I was called a flip-flopper, a switcheroo. I mean, whatever you wanted to call me, I was called. That's okay, because when I make an assessment, it generally tends to be one that's founded in fact and in reasonable analysis. And on September 1st, everything I said back in May came true. The game changed. What was a Ukrainian army that had been trained and equipped by NATO became a NATO army primarily manned by Ukrainians. The army that Ukraine used in this counteroffensive was unlike anything that ever existed before in Ukraine. It's restructured. It takes advantage of NATO leadership. There's a lot of NATO contractors working in Ukraine today, married at the hip with Ukrainians throughout the the command structure, logistic structure, and planning and implementation. There's a lot of videos coming out of the fighting in Kharkiv and Kherson, where people are speaking English with a suspiciously strong Midwestern American accent.
Yeah, I can throw one of those videos up right now. I think it's worth watching. Just to illustrate who's doing the fighting.
Next up.
Hey, they're falling back all the way.
Yeah, let's go back. Moving.
Hey, Roger that.
That sounds
Let's go. Retarded.
That was wild.
doesn't
Didn't even
sound like
get
a
the bar
Ukrainian
close.
accent to me.
Yeah, those are strong Ukrainian accents. I
think
detect a little.
Here's a guy with an American accent laying a mine in
Yep.
Ukraine. So they're, great stuff. Okay, so
Now,
yeah,
but these guys are part of what we call the International Legion, and there's several thousand of them. They do not constitute a majority of the forces used by Ukraine, but they've become, when the International Legion was first formed back in when the special military, when the war in Ukraine, I have to be careful because when I use the term special military operation, there's a specific legal and operational reality to it that I understand. But a lot of people hear it and say, "Oh, you're taking a pro-Russian bias by using Russian language." So, with all simplicity, we'll just call it the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the Ukrainians appealed for the creation of a special of this new thing called the International Legion, and thousands of people went there. Most of these people were the wrong people for the job. They were fat. They were didn't have combat experience. They were airsoft experts. Airsoft posing with fake weaponry and all that kind of stuff.
they
And
were
they went
Malcolm,
over there.
they were Malcolm Nance.
They were Malcolm Nance. I don't know if you saw Malcolm Nance's newest video where the artillery piece fires in the background and he's acting all tough.
Yeah.
But
He's like, what goes up must come down.
and then I think he used bitches or something like, tough guy, cool guy. But the point is, the International Legion was actually a detriment to the Ukrainians, and they pulled most of it off of the front lines because it was causing more harm than good. The new International Legion is something totally different. This isn't a haphazard thing. This is a concerted effort by the Special Operations Forces and the intelligence services of the United States and other NATO allies to recruit from a manpower pool that has been defined over the course of the several decades of the United States and others doing what's called foreign internal defense, where we go off and we train the militaries in Africa and Central America and South America and elsewhere. And we have developed a database of highly trained military people familiar with Western-style warfare, who the CIA and other activities can draw upon to carry out deniable operations in the world, and they do so. It's not a secret. I mean, they want it to be secret. It's not a secret. And it appears that they've drawn upon this manpower pool to rebuild the International Legion to a very professional force. If you take a look at their tactics, they're outstanding tactics. They have good command and control, good communications. They have weaponry, and they're serving as the shock troops of this new NATO army. This, prior to that, like I said, you call it a NATO army trained and equipped by, or a Ukrainian army trained and equipped by NATO. This is now a NATO army manned by primarily Ukrainians with a lot of foreigners, like we just saw. But this military is far more capable than the previous military. This military uses new tactics, new equipment. It has superior fire control management. It has the benefit of NATO intelligence, NATO command and control. This is a battle plan that was staffed by NATO with all of that entails. And again, the quality of the operation goes up significantly. And this was a strategic plan, one that employed the notions of maneuver warfare. The offense, the counteroffensive opened up against Kherson. The Ukrainians have been telegraphing Kherson for all summer long. A million-man army, march on Kherson, take Crimea. And so the first attack is against Kherson. It's repulsed. But the key thing about what this was a diversionary attack. It has to be believable. In order for it to be diversionary in nature, the enemy has to believe it's real. And so they kept pressing the attack, pressing the attack, pressing the attack, so much that it compelled the Russians to commit their strategic reserve to deal with the threat to Kherson. And then at that moment, they struck at Kharkov. At Kharkov, the Russians had withdrawn forces. They had a very complacent attitude towards defense. Instead of having regular rifle battalions on the front line, they had replaced them with the equivalent of a SWAT team, specialized military police units, militarized police units that were configured to fight anti-terrorism, organized crime, but not configured to fight on the forward edge of the battle area against tanks, artillery, armor. And then they spread the defenses out. They didn't have defense in depth. It was just disastrous. And the Ukrainians hit them with this highly trained force that knew exactly where to go. They penetrated, got into the rear area, disrupted. Long story short, Russia had a choice. It either could go to a hedgehog type defense, similar to what Adolf Hitler ordered the German army to do during the Battle of Moscow when the Russians launched their counterattack. He said for the German units to dig in, become little fortresses, hedgehogs, to break up the Russian attack. And it eventually worked. It slowed the Russians down. The Germans were able to stabilize the line at tremendous cost of human life. Tremendous cost. So the Russians had a choice. They could go hedgehog and then bring in their whatever reserves they were able to scramble and fight a median engagement, a battle of maneuver in the Russian, the rear area of Kharkov, where Russia may have prevailed, but may not have prevailed because the initiative was with the Ukrainians. And in any case, whatever happened, Russia would lose a lot of men. We're talking thousands of men dead. And if they lost the battle, thousands of prisoners, where Zelensky would be able to replicate the famous parading of German prisoners of war through the streets of Moscow. Zelensky would have been able to parade thousands of Russians of prisoners of war down Stepan Bandera Avenue in Kiev, a visual no Russian wants to see. And so to avoid that, the Russians said, we're going to abandon Kharkiv. And they conducted a very professional military withdrawal, but it was a withdrawal under pressure, which means you leave ammunition depots, you leave equipment that can't be moved rapidly, but you get your men out. The most precious resource any military has is their manpower, and Russia was able to withdraw from Kharkov in good order, preserving their manpower, reestablishing a defense line, and I have successfully blunted any effort by Ukraine to do. Let's imagine this for a second. We talked about the map of Kharkiv. 1 minute, Kharkiv Oblast is a lot of red. A couple days later, it's all blue. And the visual there is decisive Ukrainian victory. Forget the map for a second. Let me ask you the following question. Hey, Max, Aaron, there was just a big battle in Ukraine over the course of several days. Ukrainians lost around 2,000 to 3,000 dead. The Russians lost about 200 dead. Who won the battle? And the answer, of course, is well, Russia won. So here we have a situation where Ukraine visually has won. I'm not taking anything away from the Ukrainians. This was a great victory for Ukraine. Enjoy the moment, guys, because it's just that, a moment. It was a Pyrrhic victory.
Well,
you lost your strategic reserves.
Well, there's this debate about the strategic significance of Izium, which was under Russian control, and it's said to be a logistical and strategic transportation supply hub. And I even saw, putatively pro-Russian commentators lamenting the loss of Izium. But the question is, how strategic was this when the Ukrainian army clearly was able to resupply itself without control of that area?
Yeah, here's the thing about Izium. Let's imagine for a second that I'm building the transcontinental railroad across America. And now I get out west and I need to go over the Rocky Mountains. So I need a logistical hub. Let's call it Denver. And I need Denver. I have to hold Denver to get over the Rocky Mountains. And if I lose Denver, I can't get over the Rocky Mountains. But what if I decide I'm stopping at the Missouri River? I don't need Denver anymore. So Izium's only a logistical hub if Russia plans on holding Kharkiv Oblast, if Russia plans on moving further west. If Russia withdraws to the Oxal River, Izium is just a geography feature that matters. How can Izium be an important logistical command and control center for Russia when the Russian defenses are behind Izium? Izium's now on the other side. No, I mean, it was embarrassing for Russia to lose Izium. Izium was important if Russia wanted to keep Kharkov, because one of the concerns during the fight was if the Ukrainians came in and threatened Izium and the Russians tried to stay in their positions, they would cut the Russians off from their supplies. But when Russia withdrew all those forces, so Izium is no longer strategic. Look, again, this is an important political victory for Ukraine. It's a visually pleasant victory for them. They get to take a lot of selfies. Zelensky himself went to Izium and took a nice selfie. So enjoy the moment, but your strategic reserves that you just spent the summer building up, they're gone. And you didn't do that much harm to Russia. All you did is actually strengthen Russia, because Russia was in a fundamentally weak position in Kharkiv, which Ukraine exploited, NATO exploited, and Russia now has consolidated its defensives, creating a virtually impenetrable defensive line. And they've been able to, by shrinking this line, take forces that otherwise would have been dedicated to defense and move them down to the Donbass, where they can participate in the looming offensive operations designed to capture the totality of the Donbass. So I think when the final history of this is done, when the modern day version of John Erickson writes, he's a historian that wrote 2 great books about World War II on the Eastern Front, The Road to Stalingrad, Road to Berlin. When that person writes the history of the Russian-Ukrainian war, this counteroffensive, I believe, is going to go down as is the high watermark of Ukraine. This is just the best it's ever going to get. It's never going to get any better than this. And like the Confederates, Pickett's charge. You reach the fence. That's as far as you got. You lost too many guys. It's over. I think that's what this is going to turn out to be.
And Scott, what's your sense of the U.S. role in the Kharkiv offensive? There was an article in the New York Times that basically said that this offensive in Kharkiv came out of conversations between U.S. and Ukrainian officials, and the U.S. was heavily involved in supplying intelligence along with weapons.
Yeah, this was a battle plan that has made in Brussels all over it. When you say made in Brussels, it means made in the USA, because NATO doesn't have a competent battle planning staff. The United States does. This was an American planned campaign. End of story. We had the intelligence. We found the weak spots in the Russian lines. We came up with the tactics. We came up with the weaponry. And how it was going to be employed. We came up with the timing. We oversee the communications. Like I said, in addition to those guys, the Ukrainians with the outstanding Midwestern accents running around the battlefield, there's a lot of contract personnel who are at every aspect of the Ukrainian logistical, command and control, operational, organizational structure, joined at the hip with the Ukrainian counterpart, and they have an earpiece in their ear, figuratively speaking, and they receive their communications from the West, and they communicate it. So the United States is the puppet master up there making it work, and that's one of the reasons why this operation worked to the level it did. It worked very well. But 2 weeks ago, I interviewed a guy named Alexander Khodakovsky. He's the commander of what's known as the Vostok Battalion. It's a Donetsk People's Militia formation. He's very well known, very well regarded. And he said he in his blog that he writes, it's interesting war where a frontline commander is writing a daily blog, but he wrote a blog about this offensive, and he said, we got punched in the face. NATO hit us hard, and we're paying a price. This is a serious situation. He said, but they didn't knock us out, and we've now exposed the enemy for what he is. It's no longer a Ukrainian foe. This is a NATO foe. We've seen them. We know what they can do. They're never going to do it again, because we've learned our lesson. And that's the important thing here. There's an old saying, if you're going to go for the king, kill the king. But you don't make a move on the king and then fail. And that's what happened here. This is not the decisive victory that the Ukrainians and their allies are calling it. This is actually, I think, a strategic defeat, because they accomplished very little at a very high cost. And yeah, there's the thinking of the Moskva. I 100% believe that the U.S. intelligence was involved in that, and I think the Russians know that as well.
Do you have a sense of how many Russian forces are inside of Ukraine right now? And what do you make of those who say that Russia cannot achieve its objectives unless it calls up more, unless it does a draft even? inside Russia?
Look, the Russian forces are composed of forces that belong to the Russian Federation, and then militias that belong to either Lugansk or Donetsk. And then you have some volunteer units abroad. They call them the Allied forces. Right now, you're looking at around 230,000 Russian and Allied forces that are fighting there. And the Russian government has put a hard cap on the number of Russians that are going to come in because, I don't want to bore you with too much, but even though Russia has a military of 1.2 million, there are other military commitments that Russia has. They're in Syria. They're engaged in Azerbaijan, Armenia. They have to be prepared to respond to Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, which is blowing up right now. They're opposite of the Kuril Islands in the Pacific, where there's a potential conflict with Japan. They're building up forces along the Kola Peninsula and opposite Finland in anticipation of Finland and Sweden becoming NATO members, even though Turkey might block that for a while. They're positioned in Kaliningrad against the Baltic states and Poland. Russia has large-scale commitments. Georgia, some member of parliament in Georgia was just joking about, hey, we're going to have a referendum whether or not to open up a second front. I think that means that Russia has forces allocated to deal with that potential as well. So even though there's 1.2 million, there's not excess forces out there that Russia can strip away and bring down to Ukraine. They've sort of maxed out that number. So if you're going to change the number of people in Ukraine, you're going to have to do a couple things. One, general mobilization. Nobody wants to do general mobilization right now because this war is more than just what's going on in Ukraine. This is a geopolitical struggle between Russia, China, India, and the West. We saw that defined by Putin and Xi on February 4th when they met in Beijing, and they signed that 5,000-word joint statement that said we're rejecting the rules-based international order and we're replacing it with a multipolar law-based international order focused on the United Nations Charter instead of American singularity. So that's their strategic objective. One of the key aspects of this is being able to economically delink from the hegemony of the American dollar. This means they have to struggle to create something called a currency basket that can compete with the dollar when dealing with things such as a large volume trade and energy. The ruble is an important part of this currency basket, and the ruble today is very strong and very stable. General mobilization would undermine the ruble, create inflationary pressures on Russian economy, basically reverse the gains that Russia's been able to make despite economic sanctions. General mobilization creates internal domestic political issues as well. It's basically Russia slitting its own wrist. It's not a good move. So Russia needs to find a different way to generate forces. The president of Chechnya, Kadyrov, when this defeat in Kharkiv first manifested itself, he came out and said Russia needs to generally mobilize. He said it's time to take the gloves off. We need to come in hard. And then he was taken and given the briefing. And I don't mean the briefing that says stop talking bad about us or you go out the window. It's the briefing that says this is the bigger picture. The bigger picture is we're in a geopolitical struggle that we're winning right now. We are winning this. We just had a Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting where the world's coming together. Modi is talking to Putin. Putin's talking to Xi, talking to everybody. Everything's looking good. We can't disrupt this. This winter is only going to strengthen us. As Europe collapses because of the consequences of horrific energy policy, we're going to even get stronger. So what we don't want to do is give away these advantages by committing through a self-destructive act, which what general mobilization would be. And Kadyrov came back and he said, yeah, we're not going to generally mobilize. What we need to do now is create a mechanism to generate volunteer forces, which is a mechanism unique to Russia. Russia's broken down into various districts and stuff, and they have district heads. And the district heads are capable of generating volunteer forces for specific reasons. So Russia would not have to change or alter the legal foundation of what it's doing in Ukraine, which is the special military operations or specific legalities attached to that. by using this volunteer force generation model, Russia should be able to generate between 85,000 and 200,000 volunteers over the course of the winter to reinforce their forces. Now, why is this important? Because, Aaron, you asked the question, is the force structure currently capable of accomplishing the mission? And the answer is no. One of the things, the reason why this NATO intervention, this new NATO army that's appeared in here is a game changer, is that it's changed the dynamic on the ground. Russia has three objectives that they've stated, and every Russian politician throughout this conflict has said our objectives have never changed. In fact, Peskov just said that yesterday. Our objectives have not changed. What are they? One is to gain control of the newly independent republics of Lugansk and Donetsk, to return that territory to sovereign control of these new independent republics. Two, demilitarization. What does demilitarization mean? It means getting rid of all NATO infrastructure. I think we already talked about this. So they got to destroy the military. Denazification. You can't do that with 200,000 troops. You can't. It's physically impossible. So if you stick with the current force structure, what Russia's going to get is basically what it has now. The Kherson bridgehead protecting the Crimea, a land bridge connecting Kherson with the Donbass and the Russian Federation, and that's it. So what happens is you're going to have a line of demarcation, a militarized line, where Ukraine is going to be able to build up forces, fire artillery rounds in, disrupt civilian life. And it's a political defeat for Russia. Even though their military isn't destroyed, Russia loses by not winning. Russia has to win 100%. To achieve its objectives, it has to get all three of these objectives, which requires the strategic defeat of Ukraine. They can't do that with 200,000 troops. Stalemate is a Russian defeat. So to break the stalemate, you need more troops. You're going to need at least double the troops that they have today, and that can only be done through the generation of these volunteer units. So Russia has a challenge ahead of it. It's a significant challenge. It's one I think they're going to be able to meet. But when I said back in May that when you inject $53 billion worth of assistance in arms, and you create strategic depth by opening up NATO to train Ukrainian forces without fear of Russian interdiction, you've changed the reality, and the reality today has changed to the extent that Russia, with their current model, with their current force structure, cannot accomplish the goals that it set out, and therefore would be defeated.
Okay, so there's not going to be a general call up, and if there were and some other fires broke out on Russia's frontiers, which is something NATO is clearly invested in making happen, especially if you believe the pundits here in the Beltway, it would be impossible to redeploy from Ukraine. But at the onset, on February 24th, Putin announced what is now known as the Special Military Operation, the SMO. And it was sort of a term that was derided and mocked in Western media as sort of downplaying a war, but it also contained legal. It contained legal meaning that the war would be fought within a certain legal framework that would mean no decapitation of Ukrainian political leadership, no large scale deliberate attacks, massive attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. And now we've seen, since the Kharkiv counteroffensive and an outbreak of dissent within Moscow, within the Kremlin, within Kremlin-oriented media, the framework is slightly shifting. And there was, correct me if I'm wrong, an attack on the Ukrainian electrical grid. The Russian Ministry of Defense didn't announce it for whatever reason, but this seems to be outside of the legal framework of the SMO. So could Russia's Russia's strategy actually shift to expand the legal framework and intensify the war into something like what they would announce as an anti-terror operation?
Yeah,
and also we're seeing Kharkiv being pounded in recent days harder than it has.
Kharkiv is going to be pounded and pounded and pounded. Welcome to the new reality, Kharkiv. You don't kick the bear and don't expect the bear to kick back. And what goes around comes around, all that good stuff. And people are going to say the same thing about Russia. Don't invade Ukraine unless you want to counterattack. Welcome to war. Here's the deal. I don't believe that Russia can expand the SMO radically. And what I mean by that is, if you start with the special military operation here, and you have over here general mobilization, which is full-scale war here, what's in the middle? And generally speaking, legally, the next step from SMO, but falls short of general mobilization, would be a status, it basically is an anti-terrorism operation. They would be able to do something like that. But here's the danger of that. You know, Ukraine has been demanding that Russia be labeled a state sponsor of terror, and that for invading Ukraine, et cetera. And Russia has basically said, if you do this, we cut off all diplomatic relations. We'll shut down the embassy. We'll kick you out. We're going to have no relations with you whatsoever. We're done with the West.
And the Biden administration opposes that designation.
But they've come right out and said, we're not going to do that because, history teaches us that when nations stop talking to each other, very soon they're shooting at each other. So we have to keep these diplomatic channels open. We can't afford to go down that route. And so, Russia's made the case that you don't want to label us terrorist organization. So Russia has to be careful about implementing a new legal framework that labels Ukraine as a terrorist organization, because now you've opened up the political floodgates where you could get that designation back put on you, and that's troublesome. So I think politically it's very difficult for Russia to do that in a formal manner. Let's back up for a second. These attacks on the grid, the power grid. A lot of people said, "Oh, great! Russia's finally taken the gloves off. They're coming at hard. This is what they needed to do from the beginning." I have a different take on it. Let me put it this way: I participated in the planning for Operation Desert Storm and helped oversaw the implementation of it. Part of our what we did was a strategic air campaign, and one of the things we did was take out the Iraqi power grid. When we took out the Iraqi power grid, it didn't come on the next day. It was gone. It was finished, kaput, because we destroyed it. Why then, if Russia took out the power grid in eastern Ukraine, did the power come back on in Kharkiv 24 hours later? Now, it went down because the Russians hit it again. But why? Because the Russian targeting wasn't designed to destroy the power grid. Russia knows how to destroy a power grid. They know what they hit that makes it irreversible. Russia hit that which took the power grid down for a specific period of time throughout all of southern Russia. Why? Because the Russian troops were in the midst of a very dangerous, retrograde maneuver to withdraw from Kharkiv under pressure with the Ukrainian offensive forces as they were, and establish on the move a new defensive line. There's a lot of uncertainty. Units didn't have a chance to tie into the left, tie into the right, get the rear end, get the logistics up, et cetera. And so the potential was that the Ukrainians, already having the initiative, to come upon this new defensive line and pierce it. And that would cause Russia tremendous problems. So Russia needed to freeze Ukraine. They shut down the power in all of the areas that impacted the battlefield and prevented Ukrainians from continuing reinforcement, maneuver, command and control, everything. They froze the Ukrainians in place to buy time for their troops to establish defensive line. That was the purpose of the strike. This wasn't the gloves coming off, a new phase, hitting infrastructure, et cetera. I think the Ukrainians suffered one civilian casualty in the attack on the electrical infrastructure. So this, you can't say it was a strike against, what I would call a strike against the infrastructure, because had I been planning it, power wouldn't be back on in Ukraine. I can guarantee you that. The other thing is they struck a dam, and ask yourself why they struck the dam. Those war criminals. No, they struck the dam in a way that didn't kill anybody. Nobody died, but it did flood the city of Kharkiv, which is a critical. Remember, you talked about Izium being a logistics hub and command and control hub for the Russians in Kharkiv. Kharkiv is the same thing for the Ukrainians trying to attack in the vicinity of Zaporizhia. Very important. It's also politically, it's the hometown of Zelensky, but I don't think that's why they did this. But they flooded it. They blew the dam and it flooded the city, which means nobody's moving in the city right now. They froze it in place, but more importantly, they unleashed water down a river that NATO and the Ukrainians had been planing bridges across, and there was multiple layers of bridges down the river that were being used to sustain a Ukrainian force that was getting ready to attack the Russian defense. by breaking the dam, the river flood swept away all these bridges. Now that Ukrainian force on the wrong side of the river is trapped, and they're being slaughtered as we speak. It was a tactical move. And again, I think when the history of this war is written, these two strikes, the strike against the electrical grid and the strike against the dam, are going to go down as just masterpieces of military art because they stabilized an inherently unstable situation and allowed Russia to regain control of the overall battlefield by building a solid defense. And that defense right now is repelling everything the Ukrainians are throwing at it. The Ukrainians are exhausting themselves with futile attacks that are just costing them thousands of lives, and all the equipment that they had acquired over the summertime, it's gone.
Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, but did Ukraine recently knock out the grid in Belgorod, that Russian town close to the border? Or do I have that wrong?
What I heard is they knocked out the grid in Donetsk. They attacked an electrical substation in Belgorod, so they are attacking Russian infrastructure inside Russia. But the only actual loss of power that I heard of was in the city of Donetsk, which is in the Donetsk People's Republic, that newly independent republic that only Russia recognizes.
Okay, so let me read you from today's Washington Post. There's a headline that says, U.S. expects months of intense fighting in Ukraine-Russia war. And the first sentence is, despite Ukrainian forces' startling gains in the war against Russia, the Biden administration anticipates months of intense fighting with wins and losses for each side, spurring U.S. plans for an open-ended campaign with no prospect for a negotiated end in sight. That's from the Washington Post, and relaying the picture as laid out by U.S. officials that the Post spoke to. And this comes as Biden is reportedly resisting calls to send even longer range missiles than the HIMARS, those long range missiles that Biden is supplying, but he's resisting supplying other missiles. So what do you make of the U.S. strategy at this point? They're planning for a long war, but yet reportedly Biden is not giving Ukraine all the weapons that it's asking for, including these longer range missiles than HIMARS.
Back in December of last year, Russia put forward these their plans for a new European security framework, these draft treaties. One went to the U.S., one went to NATO. And while the U.S. were dismissive of it, Biden did call Putin on the phone and said, hey, what's your real concerns here? And one of the things that Putin said is, one of our absolute red lines is if you provide Ukraine with long-range missiles, that we can't, it's an existential threat to us if Ukraine has long-range missiles that, if brought up close to the Ukrainian-Russian border, can reach deep into the Russian rear and maybe even threaten the Kerch Bridge that connects Crimea with southern Russia. And Biden said, I promise you we'll never do that. We'll never do that. Russia just came out, I think yesterday, and said, if you do provide ATACMS missiles, so that's what it is. It's basically just a missile that works with the HIMARS system called the ATACMS, a 300-kilometer range. If you provide that, then you become a direct participant in the conflict, and we will act accordingly. And what I take that to mean isn't that they're going to fire nuclear weapons against Washington, D.C., but I think they're going to basically take out Ramstein Air Base, which is right now the command and control hub for U.S. NATO interface with Ukraine about weapons supplies. It's where the American planes land. Pardon? In Germany. Yeah. They'll take that right out. They'll take out all the infrastructure that relates to the logistical sustainability of ATACMS as it lands in Germany and makes its way to Ukraine. So they're going to strike Germany. They're going to strike Poland. They'll use the Kinzhal missiles and others, which there's no defense against. This will be devastating. It will kill hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans, and it will force America to either acknowledge defeat or respond in kind. And now we have this vicious cycle that leads ultimately to the end of the world because all the nuclear weapons fly. The United States knows this. This is why the Biden administration came back and said, we're not providing ATACMS, because it is literally the trigger that will end the world. And Ukraine's screaming, please help us, give us the ATACMS. They're not going to get the ATACMS, not from the United States. So there's that aspect. Now, to the Washington Post article, it's not a bad article, except one thing. I mean, let's take the writing apart for recognizing that war is cyclical in nature. I mean, it's a cycle. For someone to say wins and losses on both sides, I mean, a 3-year-old could have written that. There's no special insight here, guys. A war is cyclical in nature. You go through World War II. The Americans versus the Germans. We won, but from the moment we landed in Normandy till the moment the war stopped, it was cyclical in nature. We lost some, we won some, etc. Same thing happened in the Eastern Front. So it's an absurd statement to begin with. It's going to last for months. I just told you that Russia needs to build up, new forces of around 150 to 200,000 volunteers. It requires 4 months, 5 months to train them. So at a minimum, Russia's, this war is going to be extended at least 4 to 5 months while Russia builds the forces necessary to accomplish the mission. Then it's going to take Russia about 5 more months to finish the job. So that's 10 months. So, hey, rocket scientists in the Washington Post and it's going to take about 10 months more for Russia to finish this conflict. So that's a knowable too. We know the American goal isn't that Ukraine's going to win this war. The American goal is to create a permanent stalemate that bleeds Russia dry. And so they believe that they're on the verge of accomplishing that. I believe the exact opposite. As I said, I believe the Kharkiv offensive will go down in the history of this conflict as the high water mark. It's the equivalent of Pickett's charge. The Ukrainians aren't going to get any better than this. The war is going to basically be ground. The Russians are going to grind their way through, recapture the Donbass, probably take Odessa, come back and take Kharkiv, and they're going to accomplish the goals of the special military operation, which is the total destruction of the Ukrainian military and the denazification of the Ukrainian political system. And there's nothing NATO or the United States can do to stop it if Russia is able to get the force structure necessary to accomplish that. Why do I have this confidence? Because, frankly speaking, Russia has already destroyed the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army has been defeated. It was defeated in May, June, July of this year. They lost all of their equipment. They lost over 250,000 men, and they were fundamentally destroyed. The only thing that has saved Ukraine right now is $53 billion and the courage of Ukrainian territorial forces, untrained reservists who were mobilized, many of them against their own will, who were thrown in literal human waves into the front line, sacrificing their body to buy time for NATO to bring this new Ukrainian military into gear. Russia won the war. Russia defeated Ukraine. That was phase 2. We're in phase 3 now. This is Russia against NATO. And so, it's going to take some time for Russia to acquire the means necessary to defeat NATO. This is a NATO army. Nobody should be mistaken about that. It's actually the most capable NATO army. I'll put another challenge out there. The 30 to 50,000 NATO troops that were deployed against Russia in this recent counteroffensive, if you put them up against the equivalent size German army, they'd wipe them out. You put them up against the French army, the French would be in full retreat. The Italian army wouldn't give in on the battlefield. They're that good. They're combat hardened. They're capable, etc. NATO doesn't have a military force with the exception of the United States and maybe the British, but the British can't sustain anything. They have the shrinking, it's the Benjamin Button of militaries. It's just going away. This Ukrainian force was pretty damn good. We have to, as much as I think Russia's going to win, I never want for 1 second to take away from the courage and dedication of the Ukrainian fighting man. It's just modern war is horrific, and these guys are out there doing the job. They're paying the price, and you got to at least give them a tip of the hat. The same thing with the Russians. We can sit here and, we don't like Putin, we don't like this. At least admire the courage of the Russian fighting men. That police battalion, the SWAT team that was at the front edge of this battle, by any extent of the imagination, they should have been annihilated because SWAT teams aren't built to take on tanks. If they wanted to live, they should have retreated, as any reasonable person would have done when they saw the tanks coming. They would have run. What did they do? They held their ground. They fought. They fought hard. They didn't surrender. They didn't yield. They withstood everything the Ukrainians had threw against them, and they survived. Eventually, the Russians sent in reinforcements who attacked through the Ukrainians, got these SWAT team, and pulled them out with no casualties. They lost some wounded, but no dead. They killed hundreds of Ukrainians. This is the kind of stuff you make movies about. This is the kind, if these were Americans, there'd already be 426 book deals. Hollywood would already be dropping millions of dollars for movie rights because this would be a story that would make Saving Private Ryan pale in comparison. It's that kind of heroism. That's what's going on in Ukraine right now. And that's the tragedy of this conflict. We have the best and brightest of two nations, the Russians and the Ukrainians, killing each other, slaughtering each other on a battlefield because NATO wants to bleed the Russians dry, because NATO has decided that it makes more sense to support a government that has embraced the horrific ideology of Stepan Bandera in Nazi Germany than it does to recognize the legitimacy of Russia's concerns about a European security framework.
Well, I think Jake Tapper already wrote a book like that about some U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan.
Yeah, the outpost.
They were isolated in a little outpost, and they were just there being heroic. So I don't know. Russia will produce its own literature about the war. And sorry, everyone, my Wi-Fi was having some problems. I don't know if like NAFO got its trolls in the in the Ethernet here, but I wanted to talk about not just the battlefield, but also failures of leadership, which have been acknowledged even in circles that support what's known as Operation Z in Russia. Military Review is probably the most popular blog covering this war inside Russia. And since in July and August, when it was clear that this counteroffensive was coming and that Zelensky needed something to show his Western patrons, Military Review is calling out the Russian MOD, the Ministry of Defense, accusing it of downplaying the strength of the Ukrainian army and embellishing casualty figures. You always hear from the Russian Ministry of Defense, we eliminated 10,000. I mean, clearly the casualty rate of Ukrainians is high, but sometimes I hear these numbers and I'm like, how many Ukrainians are there? Like they must be like,
they grow on trees.
Yeah. Like how can they keep making these men? And we would always hear about like, the low birth rates in Eastern Europe. And it's like, everyone's unhappy and no one wants to have kids. And like, they're not having sex. They're just like committing suicide in bathtubs. But suddenly there's all these men and they're all dying. I mean, it just seemed a little extreme. Then, they accuse, I mean, these are like, the people who these critics were criticizing Putin and the Kremlin from the beginning for, in their view, handling the Ukrainian military with kid gloves, especially in the Kiev Oblast, which seemed to have, not worked out very well in Russia's favor. They lost a lot of men, a lot of vehicles there early on. They were like, just hit them hard, hit them right away. So they were accusing the Kremlin of dragging out the conflict that in a way that won't work in Russia's favor, engaging in an operational pause, which allowed Ukraine and actually its NATO advisors to prepare this counteroffensive. And they were raising the alarm about militia members in Donbass, the Donetsk People's Republic, Lugansk, of not having sufficient supplies, of not allowing the soldiers to see their families for months. Nothing was being done to correct mistakes that had been made early on in the war because no one wanted to publicly admit them, especially in the Ministry of Defense. These are the kind of op-eds that were seen in the pro-war Military Review, which refers to the Ukrainian government as the Ukrainian Reich. So, I mean, so we know where they're coming from. And after Kharkiv, the Ministry of Defense was kind of silent. I mean, in stark contrast to the Russian Foreign Ministry, which is very vocal and it seems to be much more willing to engage criticism and discuss all of its moves. There's this kind of stone silence around the operational strategy from the Ministry of Defense. So Scott, what do you make of these criticisms? Were there serious failures and can any of them be corrected?
Well, let's just start off by acknowledging that the Russians have done horribly in the information warfare spectrum, that the advantage has been seized by Ukraine and the United States and the British from day one. We control the narrative, we control the spin. And Russia's never been able to catch up. The Ministry of Defense briefings are very, they're boring. And as you said, they sometimes contain information that seems, if not exaggerated, just, if I were to prepare a report for a general, I'd give a range of things. I'd look at the combat and say, hey, look, best case, if every bullet we fired hit somebody, there's this many dead. But really, if you factor in other things, it's probably this. So the range is between this and this. It sounds like the Russian Ministry of Defense is coming in and just giving the best case out every time. So it looks rosy, rosy, rosy. And it's unbelievable. So they've yielded the information warfare battle space, which is, one thing. But now, one of the reasons why I think they did that is that they don't care. They're not out to wage propaganda. It's not like Ukraine is desperately, the Russians aren't desperately trying to get the United States to provide them with $53 billion lend-lease back. So they don't have to impress Washington, D.C. They don't have to play these political games. What they need to do is win the war. And it's a special military operation. I'll be one of, there's that saying, there's always a tweet. There's always a tweet. Well, there was when I was on Twitter, but I don't tweet anymore. But I did. And prior to this war, I was one of the advocates that said, I think Russia's going to win this thing quick, because I believe that Russia was going to basically run the version of Desert Storm on Ukraine. They were going to come in with a strategic air campaign that just wiped everything out, shut it all down. Then their military is going to come in doctrinally, come in hard, steamroll over the Ukrainians. This thing was going to be over. They didn't do that. I was shocked as anybody else. I've since then come to understand why they didn't do that, because this, before there was the special military operation, there was the economic sanctioning of Russia, which is the real war, the one that was designed to destroy Russia, to stop their economy, to hurt the Russian people, bring down Vladimir Putin. And we can't lose sight of that fact. That economic war is still going on today as we speak, but Russia has flipped the script and they're winning decisively. And the special military operation was designed with that in mind, that this wasn't a punitive effort against Ukraine. This was an effort to get rid, to change policies, to liberate the Donbass, and to get a policy redirection in Ukraine that could be inclusive of the Zelensky government remaining in power, but one that made sure that Ukraine would never be NATO, et cetera. So I understand why that, and I know I follow the Russian pro-war blogs, and they don't like that. They totally disagree with that approach. They wanted the hard approach from the beginning. So anything less than that automatically opens up the Russian government criticism, the Ministry of Defense criticism. So we need to understand there's a built-in bias there, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. And I think what happened here is, let's talk about the operational pause. There was an operational pause. And with all due respect to the right-wing pro-war military bloggers, hey, maybe go fight a war for a minute and you'll understand why there's an operational pause. There's not a military in the world that can sustain 4 to 5 months of constant combat and be combat effective. Every war, every military has an operational pause. When we invaded Iraq in 2003, we had a pause outside of Karbala because we outran our lines of communication. The tanks didn't have any more fuel. They didn't have ammunition. We needed to consolidate our communications. Wow, does that mean America was losing the war? No, it's just the reality of war. Check out World War II. Every single operation in European theater, operational pauses. You know what's precipitated the Battle of the Bulge? An operational pause. Because we just fought through the Benelux and we went, we're tired. We're going to dig in, rest, put a pause, regroup, etc. Redirect resources to Patton, who's moving down here, give some resources up to Montgomery, but it's a pause. Everybody does it. So do the Russians. They're not 10 feet tall. They're not supermen. They're human beings just like us. They needed to pause. The problem isn't the pause. That's a military necessity. And historically, a competent enemy will seek to take advantage of the pause because you've ceased your forward momentum and you're turning the initiative over to them so they can respond. That's the ebb and flow of war. Adults understand this. Bloggers apparently don't. People who are pro-war bloggers, grow up. But here's the problem. The Russian ministry made significant mistakes. If you got a pro-war blogger who's able to accurately state that we assess that Ukraine is assembling forces in July and August, building up these forces, one would imagine that the Russian intelligence was picking this up as well. And I believe they were. I think the Russians have a great intelligence service in terms of collection capabilities. I believe they had satellite photographs that showed equipment moving in. I believe they had signals intercepts that showed that coming in. I believe they have human intelligence reports from the spies they have in NATO headquarters that showed what was going on. I think the junior analyst was sitting there going, holy beep. They're getting ready to launch a major counteroffensive. But here comes the problem, because now he has to prepare that report, and it goes up to mid-level management. And the mid-level management guy goes, yeah, but what are you asking? They're going to do offensive. We hit a pause. Our troops are regrouping. You're telling me we don't have enough troops. That's what you're saying. Yeah, boss. Well, I can't go to my leadership right now and say I need more troops because the special military operation caps the number of troops we have. We don't have any more troops to give. We're in a pause. People are regrouping, refitting, etc. So you're not going to get any more troops. What I need you to do is soften the tone of this report. I need this report to be toned down a little bit so I can go up and say, hey, we think they're going to do this, but we have sufficient forces to contain it. Nobody needs to lose any sleep. This was one of the greatest intelligence failures in modern history, the equivalent of the Israeli intelligence failure in 1973 for the Yom Kippur War, when the Israelis tracked all the Egyptian preparations to launch an assault across the Suez Canal, but then said, we don't think Egypt's going to launch an assault against the Suez Canal. And then on Yom Kippur, Egypt launched an assault against the Suez Canal, and it was an embarrassing defeat for the Israelis. This is what happened here. This was an intelligence failure, a failure of imaginations, a failure of integrity, a failure of courage on the part of the Russian military intelligence. You know, an intelligence officer, and this is whether you're an American, a Russian, a Ukrainian, whatever, your job is not to tell your boss what they want to hear. That's what a propagandist does. That's what a spin artist does. An intelligence officer's job is to gather the facts, make the most accurate predictions possible, and present that to his boss as solid as possible, and let the chips fall where they may. It's not my fault that this is the information. I don't get to make stuff up. But once you start massaging it, then we run into the whole Iraqi WMD thing, you know, find me a threat, make me a threat, give me the intelligence I need to back up the plan. That's not how it works. Apparently that's how it worked for Russia. This was a huge mistake. They learned. The other mistake was because the intelligence didn't come through that called this the threat that it really was, the Russians didn't deploy their forces properly. This was horrific. What the Russians did, I mean, it's almost criminal in nature. And in fact, in a second, I'll tell you why it was criminal in nature. But the force disposition, putting a SWAT team on the front line, heads should roll for that. Not because of the SWAT team. Damn, they were brave. But whoever thought it was a good idea? That's like me being a Marine. I got all my hardcore Marine units on the front line, but I say I got to have an operational pause, pull them back to refit. Hey, LAPD, give me your SWAT team. Put them on the front line. Now, LAPD may be tough. They may take steroids. They may lift weights. They may be able to beat up gangsters. But they can't fight the fight that the Marine Corps can fight. This was stupidity, personified. There was a failure of imagination, a failure of leadership. There was a failure across the board. This should never have happened. It was predictable. If the bloggers knew about it, the intelligence knew about it, this was a massive failure on the part. And I agree with the bloggers on that this was a problem for the Russians. And I'll tell you why it's an even bigger problem. This is where it gets really serious for the Russians. When Putin sold this war to the Russian people, he gave two speeches, one on February 21st, one on February 24th. And in that speech, he invoked history. And he spoke about the Russian nation, not the Russian people. The Russian people are defined by the boundaries of the Russian Federation. The Russian nation is a collective of people, regardless of ethnicity, who are united by common history, common culture, common language. The Russian nation. Ukraine falls into the Russian nation, especially Eastern Ukraine. And since 2005, when Putin spoke about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the greatest catastrophe, geopolitical catastrophe and or a geopolitical catastrophe, he caveated by saying because overnight tens of millions of Russians had been abandoned or homeless. And then he said, it is my duty as the Russian president to protect the Russian nation, not the Russian people, not the Russian Federation, the Russian nation. And then he cited that in justifying this conflict. So here the Russians come into Kharkiv and they deploy their forces in there, which means in the zones that are occupied by Russia, there is a significant civilian population, the Russian nation, which is now owes its protection to the Russian military. The Russian military abandoned them. They got some of them out. A lot of them were pushed across the border, but they abandoned them. men, women, children. And you know what happens when you abandon people who are deemed to be collaborators by the Ukrainian government? We saw that in Bucha. We've had the conversation about Bucha. We know what happened in Bucha. They were slaughtered by the Ukrainian security service. And guess what's happening right now in newly liberated Kharkiv? Death squads are going around, kicking down doors. They're putting Z's on the homes of people who are accused.
Let me just jump in quickly. What I know that happened in Bucha, and I'm not I wasn't able to draw any clear conclusion, a clear enough conclusion from my point of view as the editor of the Grayzone to make an assessment like the kind I made around the dramatic theater in Mariupol. But I did see Sergei Khorotik, boatsman, the neo-Nazi from Belarus, who appeared to be calling for shooting suspected Russian collaborators on camera. I mean, that was clearly taking place during the mop-up operation. You had some of the worst fascists affiliated with the Ukrainian National Guard and the battalions coming in there.
The Safari unit.
Yeah, you did see dead bodies with aid packages, rations that had been handed out by the Russian military when they were there.
With white armbands.
Some of those dead bodies had white armbands, which supposedly which were said to signal support for the Russian forces, that these were ethnic Russians, people who wanted to assist them. So, but I can't, I don't have concrete evidence that they were massacred, that this was a false flag per se. However, we're seeing a pattern take place, and the pattern could be that, the Russians just kill everybody and leave behind mass graves. Well, one other thing that was clear to me, I'm speaking from my own point of view from Bucha, was that many of the mass graves contained the territorial defenders. They contained Ukrainian combatants. And when the Ukrainian Interior Minister, Anton Goroshenko, who shepherds the U.S. media around while he's running this kill list, which we'll talk about in a minute, he's an advisor to the Interior Minister. When he was bringing all the journalists there to film the bodies from the mass graves, many of them had BDUs, battle dress uniform on. They had fatigues. So, it's a lot like we saw in Syria, where combatants were passed off as people who were massacred in prisons in order to create this dramatic spectacle and generate sanctions and outrage. And now Zelensky has visited Izium, as you mentioned earlier, Scott, taken some photo ops, and he's now announcing the discovery of new mass graves. So, in this war, it's a hybrid war, and we're not just talking about military gains, who loses more men than the other, who gains more territory. It's also who gains the psychological and informational advantage here. And it appears that Izium will be the next site of a psychological operation to generate outrage in the West. True or not, I can't say what's true there or not.
No, I understand, and I respect that. But I'll just throw two more facts, undisputed facts, about Bucha.
And by the way, you were kicked off Twitter for your comments
for this very thing. Yeah, so I don't want to get kicked off the Grayzone. Have patience.
Well, it's us. It's between us and Google, the owners of YouTube, and we know who's behind them. So,
yeah. Well, what I'm going to say is this, and this is fact. We have a Ukrainian local politician from Bucha appearing on social media, warning the civilians in Bucha. And this is a videotape. It's her face, her voice, and she's saying, "Stay indoors. The forces are coming in. They're going to be conducting a cleansing operation, and stay indoors and don't panic." What does cleansing operation mean? Well, what we know it means is because the Safari unit belonging to the Ukrainian security service, also on their webpage, said the Safari unit's going to be coming through, and we're going to be conducting a cleansing operation against pro-Russian collaborators. So we know that the intent. Then you have the boatsmen on videotape and all this stuff. So I think the pieces add together and make a pretty compelling argument that you can't be dismissive of the possibility that the Bucha massacre was conducted by Ukrainian security forces. The idea that the only answer is Russia did it. And here's the disturbing part about this. There's a guy named Gary Tabak. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a retired U.S. Navy captain. And he appears on Ukrainian television all the time. He's very pro-Ukrainian, and he did a videotape. And to show you in the background, he has an American flag over which is draped the right sector flag. I have to tell you, as a veteran, I'm not happy about that symbology here. But he has given interviews where he says that he's an advocate of the right sector, and he also indicates that he was in Odessa in May of 2014 with right sector. He doesn't say what he did, but we know what happened in Odessa in May 2014, where right sector stuffed 150 people into a building and set it on fire, killed 84 of them. But he gave an interview to The Sun, the British newspaper The Sun, where he talked about what's going on in Kharkiv. And he basically said that the Ukrainians are hunting down the Russian collaborators and they know how to take care of them. This is an American officer who is basically endorsing the notion of filtration, the notion of holding to account those people who are deemed to be collaborators by the Ukrainian government. I'm just afraid that we're looking at another Bucha type thing there. And another reason why I'm concerned, I don't know if we're going to talk about the kill list or something down the road, but this isn't theoretical. This is real. This is a reality. This list exists. The Ukrainians kill people who don't agree with them. And so if they're willing to kill me, for instance, I've been targeted for death. If they're willing to kill me for simply speaking out, imagine what they're going to do with a Ukrainian Russian who, opened their homes up to Russian soldiers, cooked meals for the Russians, accepted money in rubles instead of the Ukrainian figure, maybe even accepted a Russian passport. If they fall in the hands of the Ukrainian security services, I don't think they're long for this world.
Well, sorry to cut you off, Aaron. I want to pass it off to you, but obviously the precedent is Odessa, the Union Hall, where scores of people were burned alive.
Yeah.
There's a lot of precedent here, and we will talk about the Mirotvorets kill list, which has marked several people as liquidated who were killed for either suspected sympathy of Russia with Russia or criticism of the war, et cetera. Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, before we get to the kill list, Scott, let's talk about a few big stories that have fallen off of the radar. The first is just recently, both sides accused the other of massacring all these Ukrainian prisoners of war inside a Russian prison. Russia said that Ukraine used HIMARS supplied by the U.S. to kill its own forces, which were being held by Russia. Ukraine accused Russia of actually killing these prisoners. Any updates on that? Have you seen anything that gives you an indication as to what actually happened? And the same with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. That was a very big story until this Ukrainian victory in the Northeast, where, again, both sides were accusing the other of shelling a nuclear plant. Without knowing into the details, the idea to me that Russia would be shelling a nuclear plant that it's occupying seemed pretty far-fetched. But in Western media, at least, we have no indication as to who is actually doing it. So your comments on both of those incidents.
Sure. Vladimir Putin. That's all I'm going to say. It's Putin's fault. He does everything bad. Everything Putin touches is evil. And Putin takes Russian artillery shells and diverts them onto Russian forces. Putin will take a HIMARS and take control of it. I'm being facetious here and probably not too successful and probably not too funny, but it just shows the absurdity of it. Russia sees that. We'll start with the prison. Russia fought a major battle in Mariupol. Mariupol was the headquarters of the Azov Regiment, which is a fundamentally neo-Nazi, horrific death squad, murdering, rapist, thuggish, the worst possible people in the world. They make the SS stormtroopers look heroic by comparison. These are bad, bad people. And not only did they capture thousands of them, but they captured the electronic media going. Because you know what Azov Regiment has in common with your average rapist, murderous, thug, scum human being? They like to document their crimes. So when they rape a woman, they film it. When they murder a child, they film it. When they torture somebody, they film it. And it's all on their cell phones. And guess who has the cell phones right now? Russia. And they're building these cases. And these are detailed cases, well documented. There will be no question about what happened. And when this story is told, It's not just going to talk about the crimes committed by these rabid dogs that need to be put down. I'm giving away I'm wearing it on my sleeve right now. I have no use for people that do this kind of stuff. But Russia's going to give them their day in court, but it's not going to be a pretty day because the case is going to be incontrovertible, and no one's going to be able to contradict it. It's not going to show the crime, but it's going to show the linkage between this crime and official Ukrainian government policy. Never forget at the end of the day that this is a Ukrainian government that has passed laws that ban the Russian language, ban Russian culture, ban Russian history, ban everything Russian. Fact is, let's take all the Ukrainian laws, put them together, and let's remove the term Russia and insert the word Jew. And now what you have is Nazi Germany. That's exactly what you have. It's the same policies, the same everything. So this is what we're talking about. And these were the guys that were on the front line. Azov Regiment came into existence after the Maidan coup revolution, whatever you're going to call it, in 2014. This was the right sector, the Nazis that came in and took over the city of Mariupol. One of the untold stories is the rape of Mariupol. What happened when these guys came into Mariupol, what they did to the Russians there. It will be documented. The story will be told. And you know who doesn't want this story told? The Zelensky government. So now the Russians have assembled the worst of the worst in this prison where they're in the process of interrogating them. They're collecting the information. They have the video evidence. They're now getting the eyewitness testimony. They're building into a case that can be presented to the world. And this will be horrific, not only for Ukraine, but for the United States, for anybody who supported this. This is, when the Russians come out and pull the trigger on this, it's going to be a tough day for the West. So what was the solution? The solution was, we know where these guys are. Let's kill them. Eliminate the witnesses.
I mean, this was, Scott, it's established that this prison was hit with a HIMARS.
That's what I'm getting at next. I mean, and the thing, thing about HIMARS.
But is that established? I know that Russia showed fragments of a HIMARS, but is it actually proven that?
Well, you're right. I haven't gone in and done the United Nations independent, impartial, analysis of the fragments and the whole and all that. You're right. We have the Russian word for it. So, in theory, it could have been, anything. There is imagery that shows the hole in the roof that hit the roof, and the nature of the hole. I am a professional at crater analysis and forensic investigation, and my looking at that allows me to create a rough indication of the line of flight, which, according to map orientation, points towards Ukraine. But I'm not in a court of law, and I haven't taken sworn testimony yet. I'm comfortable with the Russian position, but I do agree that you're right. To say that it's incontrovertible evidence that HIMARS was involved, I can't do that.
CNN asked some experts, and they denied that a HIMARS could have been involved. So there's definitely a counter narrative there.
Well, one of the reasons why they denied is that the United States. It's interesting. The United States was like, look, we don't know. We don't know what the Ukraine. See, the United States has never denied it. What the United States said, it's a he said, she said thing, man. Russia's saying this, Ukraine's saying this. We don't know. And then when people said, well, it was HIMARS, the U.S. government response was, we can't dictate what the what happens when we turn the weapons over. But what's interesting is that the deputy director of intelligence for the Kiev Oblast, the Kiev district, Ukrainian, came out and he said, every aspect of HIMARS is coordinated with the U.S. government. Every aspect of the operation, to include the targeting. So when there's a target for HIMARS, when HIMARS is released for a target, the U.S. government has cleared that target hot, approved that target. And if that's the case, this again is a Ukrainian deputy director of intelligence of the Kiev district, which is responsible for the receipt of HIMARS, says this. This means that the United States was involved in planning. And if that's the case, and let's just make it perfectly clear here, you can't strike a prison for the purpose of killing prisoners. That's a war crime. I don't care what kind of scum are in the prison. That's a violation of due process. It's a war crime, 100%. Now, Ukraine can do it because they're Ukraine. No one's going to hold them to account. But now, if they're saying that the United States was involved, that means there's a whole chain of people, military officers, serving military officers, who are now war criminals because they participated, they conspired with the Ukrainians to carry out a military action with a piece of munition controlled by the United States. It puts them in a very bad position. So I personally believe that Ukraine, with the green light of the United States, fired a HIMARS against the prison for the sole objective of killing as many of these prisoners as possible to deny their eyewitness testimony in the coming trials about the crimes of the Azov regiment. That's my personal belief. It's based on a lot of supposition. It's based upon a dearth of fact, a lot of speculation, and you can take it with a grain of salt. Now we come to Zaporizhia. Go ahead.
Before you go to Zaporizhia, there is a little precedent here just to illustrate your point, something we've reported on at the Grayzone in an article by Esha Krishnaswamy. And it's been being widely reported now in Western media that the Kremlin allies are going into prisons to recruit for the Wagner group. But in Ukraine, they have this battalion, the Tornado Battalion, whose leadership has been jailed for several years by the Ukrainian security services because they were so out of control and were documenting what they were doing, including sexually assaulting children, murdering and torturing people on camera. I mean, their cell phones made Hunter Biden's laptop look like a children's book. And I mean,
I don't mean to laugh because there's nothing funny about this, but yeah.
Ruslan Onashenko, their leader, who boasted about sexually assaulting small children on camera, and Daniel Lyashenko, who was a self-described ISIS member, a supporter of ISIS, who enjoyed beheading people. They were jailed and they have been released under the orders of Vladimir Zelensky to participate in frontline fighting in the Eastern theater of this conflict. So these are figures who just illustrate what goes on within the Azov battalion. And we've seen so many just disgusting leaked photos that actually appear on Telegram channels that are run by white nationalists like White Lives Matter. It's basically snuff, but it's documented war crimes by these forces. So, if indeed there were U.S. supplied weapons that hit this prison in Donetsk, it would be possibly the first U.S. Anti-Nazi operation since World War II.
The most successful.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise we're just like running these stay behind gangs. But go on to Zaporizhia, and hopefully you can also discuss the situation for the UN that the UN inspectors are facing.
Sure.
Since you have experience there, they've fallen in behind the Ukrainian and NATO crosshairs in the same way that Amnesty International leadership did when they accused Ukraine of hiding behind civilians. What's going on with the inspectors?
First of all, I'm going to say, Max, that I'm stealing that comment about the anti-Nazi operation. That was very clever, and I like it.
You got you got my endorsement.
Okay. And again, I just want to say for people watching, because I'm not mocking murder. I'm just saying that, we live in a horrible time with horrible things happening, and human reaction is to find humor to cope with it. So the reason why I like what Max did is that it allows me to cope with what otherwise is just literally a sickening, mind-numbingly horrific reality, and it's one that's made even more so by the potential involvement of Americans. So
yeah, my grandfather said, "Without a little mishigas, you'll go crazy." Mishigas is Yiddish for craziness, so
Well, and that's it. So we just did some mishigas, but I probably butchered that word too. Don't give a Marine a foreign word.
You did better on that word than we do on Zaporizhia. So.
Okay, what's that? Yeah, Zaporizhia. Well, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant it's the largest power plant in Ukraine. 6 operating nuclear reactors built in the 1980s by the Soviet Union. It, when fully functioning, provides up to 25% of Ukraine's electrical power generation. It had, prior to the Russians coming in, suffered serious problems because of lack of funding, lack of maintenance on the part of Ukraine's nuclear authority. Several of the reactors had been powered down because they were considered to be unsafe to operate. This again is before Russia came in. When Russia came in, they took over the plant on March 3rd. It was a moment of high drama. A videotape emerged about the Russian forces coming in, being resisted. A building caught on fire. Everybody accused the Russians of trying to burn down the facility. The Russians secured it, according to them, for a number of reasons. One, you just can't let a nuclear power plant operate on its own in a zone that you plan to take control of. So you have to take control of the nuclear power plant just for its own security. Two, in the plant, there are cooling ponds that contain depleted nuclear fuel rods, uranium fuel rods that have been depleted because they've been used in the reactor. They're very hot when they come out. They're still radioactive, just not able to function properly in the reactor core. So they bring them out and they put them in these cooling ponds so they can cool down over a period of time. It takes a long time for them to cool down. Two things. One, they're very radioactive. So if a terrorist or a government that meant to do harm got a hold of them, put high explosive on them, blew them up, you create a dirty bomb. This would be problematic for the Russians. Two, within that, when you take the uranium 235 and you irradiate it and you use it to power a reactor, you produce a substance called plutonium. And there's an awful lot of plutonium in these rods. And the Russians were concerned that Ukrainians, having already announced that they regret implementing the nuclear disarmament in the 1990s because they feel that it left them vulnerable. And they said, if we had to do it over again, we would seek to keep nuclear weapons, and we will now acquire nuclear weapons. The Russians took that seriously, and they're taking control of these fuel rods so that the ability to extract plutonium, produce nuclear weapons, has been removed from the Ukrainians. That's why they went into Chernobyl as well, to secure the fuel rods, make sure that they weren't diverted. And that's the Russian story, and I find it plausible. The Russians came in and they kept the Ukrainian operators. There's hundreds of them. They work in shifts. They live in a nearby town. That's the way it works in the former Soviet plants. Everything is a factory town, so you have a city that's linked to the operation of this plant. And the Russians let these people work. What they did do is bring in a managerial supervisory capacity from the Russian Atomic Authority, Rosatom, who's there just overseeing it, because Russia now has a legal responsibility for the site. They've occupied it, it's operating, and Russia is legally accountable for what happens at this site. And again, because this site is linked to nuclear activity, I just put the following challenge out. Any American that thinks that they can enter a functioning nuclear power plant in America and just walk around, try it, see what happens. What's going to happen is a guy dressed in camouflage is going to put you on the ground with a gun to your head, because we're not allowed to do that. It's highly secured. We secure nuclear power plants. The Russians have done the same thing with a 500-man unit. It's also a unit that has a safety element, a nuclear, biological, chemical, and radiological unit there to detect radiation leaks potential. That's all there at the site. What's not at the site is heavy weaponry. What's not at the site is tanks, artillery, mortars. And why is that important? Because on August 1st, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, spoke and accused Russia of using the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant as a nuclear shield behind which the Russians were firing artillery with immunity and impunity against the Ukrainians, and this would create an unacceptable situation. And on August 5th, the Ukrainians started lobbing shells into the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, saying that, well, first they said it's Russia shelling themselves. I mean, just the absurdity of that should just be dismissed right off the bat. But then later on, even Zelensky had to walk away from that. He said, no, we're doing it because the Russians are shelling us. We have to respond. That any risk that's brought in by the shelling of this plant is because of Russia. And what we need is an international peacekeeping force to come in and take control of the plant and the area around the plant, demilitarize it, and then return it to Ukrainian sovereignty. That was the goal and the objective. And they've been shelling the plant ever since then. There's a lot of talk about a new Chernobyl, a Fukushima, things of that. Look, anytime you lob high explosives in a nuclear power plant, it's not a good thing. But it's a plant that's built to withstand this kind of thing. The problem doesn't come penetrating the reactor. The problem comes cutting down the power or penetrating the coolant, breaking apart one of these nuclear fuel rods, creating a mini dirty bomb. This is all real, and Ukraine's doing it. They're shelling the plant. It's not Russia. Now, one of the things that happened here is that Russia's always been trying to get the International Atomic Energy Agency to come into the plant. But Ukraine didn't want that because the problem with an IAEA inspection is they're probably going to learn the truth. And Ukraine's not in the business of telling the truth. Ukraine's in the business of spinning disinformation. Create the perception that Russia is using the plant as a shield behind which it can attack Ukraine. But because of the shelling, the United States, Ukraine, and the United Nations began advocating for this peace force. They want this peace force. The Secretary General wants this peace force. Everybody wants this peace force. So they dispatched this team of nuclear inspectors, 14 strong, led by the Director General of the IAEA. They went to the site. What's interesting is that Russia first said, we want them to come in through the Russian-controlled territory because then we can guarantee their security because we own the plant. You come in, seamless security. The Ukrainians said, no, it's our plant. We have the safeguards agreement with the IAEA, so they're going to come in through Kiev. Russia conceded that point, but said you have to bring 2 ballistic missile or ballistics experts on the team that can do crater analysis and find out what's going on with these strikes. So the team came in. They only spent, of the 14 of them, 8 of them only spent a couple of hours there, during which time the ballistics people did evaluate the craters that were produced, but not from a standpoint of telling who did it. There's no mandate with the IAEA to ascertain responsibility. What they were supposed to do is look at the potential damage caused and what that did in terms of posing a threat to the operational safety of the plant. They were also able to interview people. They were able to do an inspection of the plant, and 8 of the 14 withdrew same day, leaving 6 behind within 3 or 4 days. 4 of those guys left, and they left 2 IAEA personnel behind to stay at the site. The purpose of the IAEA people at the site was, some people call them hostages, that they're there to prevent the shelling. Well, they haven't prevented any shelling. They're getting shelled every day from Ukraine. They're there to facilitate communication between the operators of the plant and the IAEA so that the IAEA can get a clearer picture of what the safety reality is, profile of the plant. But the team Grossi, the Director General, came back and issued a report. And in it, he refused to acknowledge, say who did the attacks. And this disappointed the Russians tremendously because the evidence is right there. Again, I'm a crater analysis kind of guy. I have to tell you right now, with 100% certainty, that would be viewed as legitimate testimony in any court in the world. I could come in and do a quick forensic of any shell crater and tell you which direction it came from, what kind of shell it was, etc. And so to say that the IAEA doesn't know is absurd. It's a lie. It's quite evident who did it. But the IAEA won't say who did it because this is a political issue. And they've sidestepped that one. And that bothers Russia tremendously because the international community is using the continued strikes against this plant as justification because the IAEA has come out and said, we're advocating for international security force to take over the plant. So the Russians feel betrayed. They feel like the IAEA came in, saw the evidence of who was doing this, but they're still putting out the big plan. And here's another spin on the big plan. The IAEA team landed in Kiev on 29 August. They were supposed to proceed directly to the plant. They didn't. Zelensky held them up. Zelensky insisted on a meeting, and they had the meeting. And then they were delayed another day for unspecified reasons, and then they went. As they traveled to the site, the Ukrainians launched a major commando attack against the site. Up to 700 people, an amphibious assault, helicopters, trying to seize the site, to take control of the site before the IAEA inspectors came so that they can bring the IAEA inspectors in and effectively use them as a shield against Russian retaliation. You can't attack us, the IAEA is here, and now we need the international peacekeeping force to come in and set this thing up. And Grossi talks about this. He says, there was heavy fighting while we were there. There was machine guns, mortars. It was all taking place, very disturbing, very worrisome. Did Grossi know that this attack was going to take place? I mean, he met with Zelensky. People are saying this attack was planned at the presidential level. So Zelensky clearly knew that the attack was taking place. The president of Ukraine met with the IAEA and then gave them the green light to go to a nuclear power plant that he knew his forces were going to be attacking for the purpose of seizing control that morning. Think about it. The Secretary General was also involved in coordinating it. This stinks to high heaven, stinks to high heaven. Now, I will say this. I've been involved personally in a United Nations inspection that was hijacked by the CIA to launch a coup against Saddam Hussein. That occurred in June of 1996. I was not party to the planning. I didn't know anything about it. So I think it's possible that Grossi didn't know anything about this, that Grossi's team is honest and trying to carry out an objective thing. But his leadership knew about it. His leadership knew about it. They were conspiring. They continued to conspire with Ukraine and the United States and Great Britain and France to try and get this international peacekeeping force put into Zaporizhia. And why is this critical? Because this is nuclear blackmail. This is the United States, Ukraine, and Europe holding the world hostage, not for nuclear safety, but to score political points for Zelensky regime, to create a political victory, to insert a reality onto the battlefield that otherwise would never exist. And this undermines the credibility of the IAEA in every way, shape, and form, similar to how the OPCW's credibility was undermined in Syria, and how the United Nations credibility was undermined in Iraq. This is the United States, the West, undermining international institutions that are critical for international peace and security.
Thanks everyone for staying with us, except for the 1,000 or so paid Atlantic Council trolls. We got like 6,800 people here with us now, Scott. So I wonder if you could stay for one or two more questions.
Sure.
Great. Well, thanks for being so generous with your time, and you know, everyone who's not a paid Atlantic Council troll, hit the like button. Like us. You can't dislike the video because the dislike function was removed by YouTube because every Anthony Fauci interview is getting too many dislikes. So they just removed the dislike function for everybody else's video. So another thing to blame Fauci for. But Aaron, you had a question. Or did you?
Yeah, Scott. So Fiona Hill, former senior official under George W. Bush and under Trump, recently confirmed in Foreign Affairs that U.S. officials knew that back in April there was the broad outline of an agreement between Ukraine and Russia, which is basically Russia would return to its pre-invasion position, and in exchange, Ukraine would declare neutrality and also be provided with security guarantees. And what Fiona Hill left out was what was reported in the Ukrainian media, which is that right after that agreement was reached, Boris Johnson was dispatched to go to Kiev and met with Zelensky and told him, you cannot make a deal with Putin, and if you do, we will not provide you with any security guarantees, thereby rendering any such agreement with Russia worthless. So that sabotaged diplomacy. What I'm wondering is, in your assessment, do you think such a deal, like the one that was reportedly agreed on back in April, is still possible now?
No, 100% not. There will never be a negotiation. It's not just my position. The Russians have said the same thing. The day of that kind of negotiation is long gone. Too much has transpired since then. And the other thing is Zelensky has committed to NATO. I mean, even though they're not a NATO member, Ukraine is more NATO than just about any other NATO nation. And so I don't see any backing down. Plus the again, now we come into that, sort of a philosophical question about what is the Russian nation. There's just no way politically Putin could allow that kind of deal, because it would allow too many members of what he calls the Russian nation to be under the sovereignty of a government that calls them orcs, that treats them as subhumans, that has basically dehumanized them, eliminated the culture, the history, the language. So politically, it's impossible for the Russian government to cut that kind of deal today with the Zelensky government. It might have been available to them early on. I think Fiona Hill is, frankly speaking, giving far more credence to a negotiation that had not been as settled as she claims it was. There was a lot of problems with that negotiation. But today, the Russians have, even though Putin is telling Modi and others that we are looking for a negotiated settlement, a path to negotiations, I don't see doing that, because this would be a strategic defeat for Russia at this point in time. It would be a strategic victory for Ukraine, a strategic defeat for Russia, and at a time when Putin is winning the geopolitical struggle to transition from American singularity to global multipolarity. So, and that's the big picture. So I don't see Putin undermining everything by agreeing to a negotiation that gives away too much and accepts nothing.
So quick follow-up, because we haven't addressed this yet. Does this mean we're, in your view, guaranteed to have a war dragging through winter? And is Russia, how much of Russia's strategy is relying on Europeans turning against their own governments after they suffer the impact of cutting off Russian energy and dealing with energy rationing, not having heat, not having food during the wintertime?
I think Russia's operating on two parallel campaign strategies. One is a military campaign that's totally divorced from anything else, and the other is a geopolitical campaign that relates to the economic sanctions. Just looking at how the Russians believe, I mean, I think it's widely accepted that Russia was looking for a quick victory when they first went into Ukraine. Phase one was supposed to be sort of a shock and awe thing that caused the Ukrainian government to collapse and seek negotiated settlement. That didn't work. March 25th, they transitioned to phase two. And I think phase two was seeking to create a new reality by capturing totality of the Donbass region and then rapidly turning to Ukraine and say, this is the reality. Let's have an agreement. The defense of the Donbass proved to be too tough of a nut for Russia to crack. I mean, when you have 8 years to dig in and create the most sophisticated, detailed, in-depth trench fortification system, it takes a long time. And Russia was slowly picking it apart, but it wasn't going at the pace. And now we have phase three, this new phase, even though it's not formally announced by Russia. There's a new reality called the NATO $53 billion that Russia has to deal with. So the military campaign is now facing the reality that this thing is going to go through the wintertime easily. If Russia is going to generate, another 100, 200,000 of volunteers, it takes 4 months to train them minimum. And so automatically this is going to go through the wintertime automatically. But come spring, I think Russia is going to resume the offense, this time with sufficient forces to the task. And they're not only going to secure the Donbass, but I think you're looking at Novorossiya becoming a political reality. Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnepropetrovsk, all becoming under Russian control, to the goal of which is to cause a collapse in the Ukrainian government, which facilitates demilitarization, denazification. That's the Russian plan. No plan survives initial contact with the enemy, and we have no idea how this is going to play out. That's my understanding of what the Russian military plan is. It's separate from the geopolitical plan, which has transformed into, and believe me, Russia didn't want to go down this path. Russia did not want to hurt Europe. This was never Russia's goal and objective. The freezing of Europe is solely the responsibility of the Europeans. If Russia wanted to freeze Europe, they would have shut off the gas on day one. Russia has been willing to sell energy to Europe at contract rates. It's Europe that opted out. And now because Europe opted out, Russia is now, and the Europe opting out of the Russian willingness to sell is parallel to the decision to provide $53 billion plus of aid to Ukraine. So now Russia has made that linkage and has determined that the European policies are inherently bad for Russia. Therefore, Russia is going to exploit the vulnerability that Europe created by its sanctioning Russian energy, exploit it by letting winter do its thing. And I think Russia is going to position itself to best exploit whatever outcome comes, whether governments fall, whether governments change, whether there's revolution, whatever. Russia will be there to make sure that whatever transpires in post-winter Europe can be used to Russia's advantage. And that's the diplomatic link. The fact the two are operating in parallel, and right now we seem to have coinciding timelines. but I think that's more of an accident of history as opposed to some Russian 5D chess player back in the Kremlin thinking all of this out in February.
Right. Right. Well, I have a before my question, I just wanted to introduce a conspiracy theory, and shout out to Scott's dog. He's been a
Yeah,
loyal,
I don't know how to shut them up.
Is that Maverick,
loyal
Scott?
viewer, Grayzone viewer.
That's all three of them now. It's a concert. It's a concert.
It's the three hounds of the apocalypse. Okay, well, this is a video from 2020 of Ursula von der Leyen showing people how to wash their hands. And I think it's a conspiracy because I'm obviously being tongue in cheek, but she turns off the water while she is showing you how to wash your hands. And it's almost like she's preparing 2 years in advance for an energy crisis. This is really helpful if you're in Europe right now. Please follow these instructions because you might not have hot water this winter. Gather wood at your local tree because you might need to burn it because of this woman, Ursula von der Leyen, who married into the, wow, there it is. Look at that. Do you trust her? I don't know. Did anyone ever elect this bride of Frankenstein looking freak who actually married into the von der Leyen family that ran a silk factory in Germany, which was so cruel to its workers in the 1830s, I believe it was, that it was one of the first workers' strikes in Germany, and it was documented by a young man named Karl Marx. So that's who she is. Her hands are definitely clean. Anyway, enjoy winter. It's going to be, I mean, and we're starting to see a lot of protest activity in Germany now, all across Europe. And this is putting increasing pressure. The German military is preparing to deploy in October ahead of what the interior minister calls a winter of radical riots. So this is, these are boomerang sanctions. But
didn't that work out well for Tsarist Russia? I thought when those guys, what were they called, Bolsheviks, and they were demonstrating in the streets, and the Tsar sent the Russian military out to what happened? Oh yeah, they flipped, and that was the end of the Tsar. Hey, Schultz, bad idea, man. Don't send the troops against the people. Not when the people are protesting against your policies. Go ahead, Max. I apologize.
Well, they already did to some extent during COVID. I mean, the amount of military on the streets, it seems like it was a preparation. But, I wanted to talk, Scott, about the information war, and which has affected us personally. This is, as I said, a hybrid war. As everyone understands, it's a hybrid war. And the Ukrainian government emphasizes the information aspect, the psychological aspect, more than the Russians do, because they have the edge. Their allies are the masters of this, the US and NATO. And so I interviewed a 13-year-old from Lugansk last week named Faina Sevankova, who is on what is now informally known as a government-sponsored kill list in Ukraine, known as Mirotvorets, or the Peacemaker. She's one of over 320 children listed on this website. Their personal information is provided down to their phone numbers, personal details. If you look at her page, there are so many photographs of her. And these are minors. I mean, this is a violation of their human rights. As we pointed out in this interview, the site is maintained with the support of Anton Gerashenko, who's an advisor to the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. It is a government-sponsored website. And Scott, you have a profile on there. Several Americans are on there who are critics of this proxy war. And I wanted to address something that has happened to me recently. I'm not on there, haven't been able to find myself. Maybe the people who edit my Wikipedia page will put me on there. But my Wikipedia page already, serves that purpose. But last month, or I think it was about 6 weeks ago, hundreds of journalists received a email from a former advisor to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry from a organization called MOLFAR, which is based in London and has been sponsored by the U.S. Agency for International Development and the British Foreign Office. And they were furnishing a dossier of me, which claimed to contain proof that I have been recruited by Russia to be a Russian asset and been given all this this vast fortune and a mansion in order to propagandize on behalf of Russia, and that if you wrote back to them as a journalist, you could get this secret dossier. So I had journalistic colleagues write to Molfar asking for this, and they actually said, we're not going to give it to you because you're just going to use it against us, because you're not on our side. Eventually, one of them got it, and I saw what it contained. First of all, it showed that I'm extremely frugal and not very wealthy, but it contained some kind of financial intelligence on me, which is, available to the public pretty much. It also contained, it attempted to dox me. It attempted to provide anyone who asked my personal details, but it also attempted to dox every single member of my family. And it even doxed the editor of my younger brother, who's also, works in media, who used to edit for the New York Times, who has nothing to do with this conflict at all, and contains her personal information. And so it was pretty clear what they're trying to do. They're trying to intimidate me into silence with the fear that I could get iced for my personal opinions and my factual journalism about this conflict, and specifically about the role of my own government. And what I think about Molfar and what they're doing is they're actually fronting for my government, which is at least legally and formally banned from doing this kind of thing to its own citizens. The intelligence services, the CIA, is not supposed to target American citizens on American soil. So this seems to be an outsourcing operation. To me, this is when you look at what's happening on Mirot Vorets, the peacemaker site, where Daria Dugina, who was killed in a car bomb by a Ukrainian agent, someone who was in the Azov battalion, with their assistance inside Russian territory, and then she's marked as liquidated on that site. It is a kill list, and she's not the only person who's been marked as liquidated. Journalists, there are 400 journalists on this website maintained by the Ukrainian government. The journalists who have been killed have been marked as liquidated. So Scott, you're on that site. What do you think about this dimension of the war? What is the purpose of this site, and what can be done about it?
Let me start off. First of all, yeah, I'm on the site. We'll get to that to say. I just want to talk. You mentioned you interviewed the young lady, the
Faina Sevankova. She's 13 years old.
I need to bring something up. I think last week or some, I got an email from somebody who claimed to be representing her, and they said that that she wanted to get in contact with me, and they wanted to set up an interview and everything. And I have to say that my red flags went up. I just was thinking this is a setup. They want to get Scott Ritter to be talking to a 13-year-old girl and all this kind of stuff. So I wrote a polite but firm email back refusing the request. And I explained why. I said, I don't want to subject. I said, I have thick skin. I can handle this kind of stuff. But if she's really what she says she is, I don't want to subject her to, this kind of absurdity. And she sent me a personal email back, and she said, I respect that. But I'm not a child anymore. I'm on a kill list. They're trying to murder me. I've become an adult overnight and all that stuff. And so, I want to send out an apology to her. I understand, she's a woman of great courage, and she shouldn't be on this list. And I applaud everything she's doing, and support her work and the work of anybody affiliated with her. So I just wanted to send out that apology that, I was acting what I thought was her best interest, but clearly she's a person of greater courage than me. So I give her that shout out, and I want to thank you for doing the interview with her. This is a serious list. I appeared on that list, and shortly thereafter, a YouTube video came out with a guy. It's poorly done, dubbed over with a thick British accent, but it basically said that they're going to hunt me down and kill me. That's what they want to do. That I'm on this list. I will be liquidated next. I don't know what's appearing on your chat. I've been on some podcasts where in the middle of the podcast, people are coming in and in the chat room saying, Ritter go boom boom. Ritter and his family go boom boom, meaning they're going to blow me up. So, again, I'm a grown up. I don't panic, but this is real. This is not a theoretical list. This is not a joke. This is real. People die. And to be on this list is an issue of concern. You talked about, the linkage. I don't know what the financial linkage between Mira Troitz and the U.S. government is. What I do know is a parallel list called the so-called blacklist, published by the Center for the Center for Countering Disinformation. This center was announced in April. On July 14th, they held a meeting where they published this list. 72 people on it, including many prominent Americans, and myself, a less prominent American. And we were called information terrorists. And we were called war criminals who should be prosecuted for war crimes. What we do know is that the salaries of everybody at that institute are paid for by the United States taxpayer. The salaries are linked to money that were approved by Congress through Public Law 117-128, adopted on May 21st of this year, signed into law by President Biden. We pay them their salaries. This meeting was organized by a U.S.-funded NGO that was created by the U.S. Congress. And in attendance at this meeting were State Department officials and members of the U.S. Embassy. So right off the bat, if the embassy wants to say, well, we were just in attendance. Well, what did you think when they published a list with American citizens' names who are being called information terrorists for the sole crime of exercising their freedom of speech? Because that's all I'm guilty of. The three things that are labeled on this site is the Bucha incident, my saying that Ukraine was provided a permanent NATO base, which they did, training facilities prior to this war, and that this was a proxy conflict between NATO and Ukraine. Those three things, which are all fact-based, have labeled me a Russian propagandist. And I don't need to tell this to you guys, that has a chilling effect on your viability and employability. I used to write for a couple outlets. I won't name them out of respect for them, but they know who they are and they know why they released me. And they released me because I wrote also for RT. And they said, we can't be affiliated with a Russian propagandist, words to that effect. So it has a chilling effect, an economic impact on it. But I don't mind that. That's okay. I don't like the concept of being an information terrorist. Why? Because on September 1st and 2nd, there was a second meeting of this organization, again, attended by members of the Department of State and the U.S. Embassy, where they emphasized information terrorists, but they focused on the terrorist aspect and said, we need to treat these people as real terrorists. I've been around the world long enough to know how real terrorists are treated. Targets are put on their back. And why am I concerned about this? Remember when I talked about Gary Tabak and the U.S. flag with the right sector image on it? 60 miles down the road is a town called Ellenville, New York. In Ellenville is a park. In the park is a monument to Stepan Bandera and three other Ukrainian Nazi collaborators, where the Ukrainian American community rallies, holds camps where they train the youth to worship Stepan Bandera. When you have ideologically motivated people like this who have the gall to put the right sector flag over the American banner, living this close to me, and you have the U.S. government saying, oh yeah, we concur, he's an information terrorist, and you have the Mir Tvoretz hit list marking me for death. It doesn't take Tom Clancy to put two and two together to come up with a really cool novel about how somebody knocked off Scott Ritter and his family and maybe killed his dog so his dog didn't bark in the background of interviews. But the point is, this is real. This is a problem in America. We give succor and support to worshipers of Stepan Bandera right here in America. People who are calling people who exercise free speech. And here's the most worrisome aspect of it. They're funded by the U.S. Congress. The Constitution, under the First Amendment, prohibits the U.S. Congress from passing any laws that abridge free speech of Americans in the free press. Congress passed a law, 117-128. They used money to fund a foreign entity who then targets Americans for intimidation and death for exercising their free speech. This is Congress creating a proxy to do that which they were prohibited from doing by law. I'm not taking this sitting down. I'm working right now with some constitutional lawyers, goal of which is to get a federal injunction freezing all monies appropriated by this law, until which time the State Department disassociates itself from this list and stops funding people who are promulgating this list. This is a significant problem. They're targeting a sitting senator, Senator Rand Paul. He's a big boy. He should be able to take care of it. I don't know why Rand Paul is allowing this to happen. Targeting Diane Sayre, who is a candidate for Chuck Schumer's seat, challenging him in the election. They target Tulsi Gabbard. They target me, McGregor, Ray McGovern, and others.
Roger Waters.
Roger, well, he's British. Target the British all you want. I'm joking.
Right.
Don't try. No, but no. Eva Bartlett, a very brave journalist, she's targeted. This is just absurd. And the Congress is behind this. This is the American government funding the suppression of free speech, which I thought the Constitution prohibited.
Well, I'm personally glad you're fighting back. It needs to be challenged, and the best we can do here is to continue to expose it and those behind it. But Scott, thank you for being so generous with your time. And Aaron, I don't know if there's anything you want to add before we get out of here. And also, we want to make sure your dogs don't wind up on any.
I don't know what they're doing. They're going crazy.
Scott, we know how busy you are. You put out multiple articles a week, and
Aaron just froze, but he was saying.
So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I certainly appreciate it. It's an honor and a privilege to be on a platform like this, and I thank you for giving me the time.
Thanks, and yeah, I think we get more viewers with you on here than any MSNBC or CNN live stream. So
I'll say thanks.
Great success, Aaron. See you soon, and thanks everyone for joining us, except for the paid Atlanta Council trolls, of which there were many. We'll be back next week. Watch this space. And remember, wash your hands and turn off the water for 20 seconds, like Ursula von der Leyen says, because there ain't going to be hot water coming soon. Peace.
Bye. Thanks.